During this video, we'll be discussing documentation. Documentation is a critical part of your job when working in the facility. Documentation serves several very important functions. First, documentation provides a legal record of the care provided to your client. Should there ever be a challenge as to whether or not care was appropriately provided, without accurate written documentation, it is difficult, if not impossible, to prove the care you provided to your clients. A general rule of thumb when working in the facility is if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. Documentation also helps to ensure continuity of care. For example, a written service plan helps to ensure that all care providers understand the needs and services of the individual client. It helps to ensure that we all provide for those basic needs during each shift worked. Documentation is also a communication tool. It helps us to communicate with the physician, with hospice and home health, with other caregivers, and also can help us to communicate with the client's family.
You know, it is really great, though, that they do the documentation, because sometimes I can't get off work on time to go and see her, and I don't know how her day has been. So they're very helpful. Whenever I can just call them up and ask them, did anything unusual happen with my mom today? Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. I visited my mom today. She's been complaining to me about constipation, and I wondered when was her last bowel movement.
Oh, I see.
Finally, documentation is often required by regulatory or other agencies. Regulations in your state may stipulate the type and frequency of documentation required. While documentation can sometimes seem tedious and time-consuming, it's important to understand that by completing thorough and accurate documentation, you help to ensure that all of these critical needs are met. While the exact methods used may vary from one facility to another, there are some basics to consider in terms of where and how to store your client's records or your documentation. First and foremost, client records should be stored in a central and secure area that is accessible to appropriate staff, but at the same time is inaccessible to unauthorized persons, such as visitors and possibly families. We also want to ensure that the area where records are stored is secure from fire and water damage. For example, if your community has a sprinkler system, we would want to ensure that records are kept in a closed cabinet should those sprinklers ever go off during a fire or other emergency. In many communities, there are 2 records kept for each client. One record for all of their care documentation, such as narrative notes, medication records, admission assessments, and the like, and a separate record that contains all of their financial information, such as admission agreements, designation of financial responsible parties, etc. This helps to ensure that only the necessary persons have access to very sensitive financial data, and at the same time, persons such as business managers do not have access to confidential care records. One of the most important issues to consider with documentation is ensuring confidentiality. It is important that client records are handled and maintained in such a way that does not allow for them to be viewed or accessed by unauthorized persons. All client records are considered private and confidential. It is very important that as a staff member, you do not give client information or records to any unauthorized persons. This could include their family, outside agencies, or other individuals. If someone ever asks you to provide copies of a client's record or give them access to a client's chart, and you're not sure if they should have that access, check with your supervisor. Never be embarrassed to ask your supervisor if someone should have access to client records.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you again. My sisters and I have been discussing some different possible arrangements for my mom, our mom, and we'd really like to have a copy of her charts and everything.
I know the resident's record is to remain confidential. I know the resident expects me to keep it confidential. When someone asks me if they can see the record, I be sure they're authorized to see it, or I check with my administrator.
Should an authorized individual request access to a client's record, never allow them to take the original record from the building. Again, speak with your supervisor beforehand, but there may be instances in which you'll make copies of a client's record for an authorized person. Examples of persons that are authorized to receive a client's record include the client or resident themselves. In most states, the state licensing agency and its representatives are authorized to view a client's record. Healthcare providers such as physicians, and of course appropriate facility staff such as nurses, medication aides, and other caregivers. Again, if you're ever unsure, check with your supervisor. Here are some additional things you can do to help maintain confidentiality of client records. Number one, always be sure that you document in a private area, such as the medication room, staff room, or other administrative area. Do not take a client's record out into common spaces to complete your documentation. For example, documenting in the dining room would not be a good idea. Do not talk about your clients or their care. If you are walking down a hallway, standing in an elevator, or even in an employee break room, be careful that you're not discussing confidential client data where someone else could hear it. Be careful with walkie-talkies. If you're having to discuss a client over the walkie-talkie, such as, "Could someone please help me take Mrs. Smith to the shower," rather than saying that over the walkie-talkie, one common practice is to use room numbers. For example, "Could someone please assist me in room 102? There are typically many different types of documentation used in a facility. These types of documentation include assessments, such as physician's reports, admission assessments, and nursing assessments. When we use the word assessment, we are referring to acts carried out by a licensed medical professional, such as a physician or nurse. We may also see appraisals. Now check with your state regulations, but typically an appraisal may be completed by someone who is not a licensed medical professional, such as an activity appraisal, an admission appraisal, an ADL appraisal. We will also find in the client's record narrative charting. We'll be talking more about this type of documentation later. Most facilities also maintain service plans or care plans. These are written records that outline the needs and services for an individual client. There's also a whole variety of care records, such as medication records, vital signs records, activity attendance sheets, and the like. End of shift reports are also very useful. These are forms or records that are completed by each caregiver at the end of their shift. On this form, the caregiver will indicate any important changes or occurrences for each resident during their shift. Finally, there's also a whole host of legal and financial records, admission agreements, powers of attorney, etc. As we mentioned earlier, these are very often kept in a separate file or chart. Check your facility's chart map to find out where these different pieces of documentation belong in the client's record. These different pieces of documentation may be organized in a wide variety of methods. Most facilities use something similar to a 3-ring binder with dividers to help us find the different pieces of documentation. However, some facilities will use file folders, envelopes, or even possibly computer systems to help maintain client records. There are various acceptable charting methodologies utilized, and while these are very rarely dictated by state regulation, they are typically found in your facility policies. So check with your facility administrator or policy and procedure manual to verify the charting methods that you are to be using. Some common charting methods include scheduled charting, in which staff are instructed to chart on a regular scheduled basis, such as the beginning and end of each shift, once each day, every hour, etc. In many facilities, it's common to require scheduled charting during the first several days of a client's admission. For example, your facility policy may require that staff document on a client's condition at the end of each shift for the first 72 hours of their stay. Many facilities utilize a method known as charting to the exception. Charting to the exception means that we do not necessarily document on a regular schedule, but we chart when something unusual happens. We chart to the exception. So, for example, if a client had a very normal, good day, it would not be necessary to note anything in their record. In the charting to the exception methodology, we would not write in their record, Mrs. Smith had a great day. However, if something unusual happened, such as Mrs. Smith was complaining of an upset stomach, or if the client had a fall or other injury or emergency, then a note would be made in their chart. Charting to the exception has several benefits. One of the first is that it reduces staff time spent documenting, so that rather than having to make copious notes in a client's record, we only have to make notes when something unusual or different happens. The other important benefit to charting to the exception is that it simplifies the review of the client's record. If a supervisor wants to go back and see how a client's condition has been progressing, rather than having to read through pages of notes on a client, they can scan through several simple paragraphs and see if any significant changes or occurrences.
At our facility, we use a system called charting to the exception. This means we don't have to chart all the usual activities throughout the day for a client. We chart things that are different, things that have become changed. This saves a lot of paperwork and extra work, and it also helps give a clearer picture, and that's why we call it charting to the exception.
Another common charting method that can actually be used in conjunction with either scheduled charting or charting to the exception is D.A.R charting. D.A.R is an acronym that stands for Data Action Response. By using the D.A.R method of charting, it helps to ensure that every note made in the client's record is complete. One common challenge with narrative charting is that we find incomplete notes in the client's record. For example, a note might say, Mrs. Smith was complaining of stomach pain, and that's all. To be an effective piece of documentation, each narrative entry must provide a complete picture. So by using D.A.R, it ensures that we complete those three vital pieces of information. Number one, the data. This is where we explain what happened, such as Mrs. Smith was complaining of stomach pain. A is the action. What did you or other staff members do about it? Such as we called Mrs. Smith's doctor for further instruction, or called 911, or provided first aid, whatever was appropriate, of course, in the situation. And finally, R is response. What was the client's response to your actions? What was the resolution of the situation? Mrs. Smith was transported to the hospital via paramedics. The D.A.R. D.A.R method of charting is a very simple way to ensure that all narrative entries are complete and thorough. Let's talk about how to complete a narrative entry in a client's record. The important basics to know are when to chart, where to chart, what to chart, and how to properly make an entry. First of all, when to narrative chart. As we discussed, this is based very much on the methodology utilized by your facility. But some instances in which you would definitely want to make a narrative entry in the client's record include if there is any change in the client's condition, such as a worsening health problem, change in behaviors, etc., following any emergency situations, such as a fall, having to go to the hospital, etc., after communications with any important person, such as the physician or family, and again, according to your facility policy. Where to narrative chart? Well, in the vast majority of facilities, you're going to make your narrative entries in the client's chart. There will often be a section of the chart labeled narrative notes, and in here is where you would make your entries. But these principles would also apply to end of shift reports or other similar charting devices. The narrative charting form itself will vary from one facility to another, but they are typically fairly simple forms with some common elements. Normally, somewhere near the top or the bottom of the form, you will find a place to list the client's name and room number. Then in the main body of the form, there is typically a column for date, time, and then an area to make your narrative entry. It is important that in each narrative entry you include the following important pieces of information: the date, the time, the narrative entry itself, and then you complete by signing the note. If there is any blank space left at the end of your entry, draw a straight line to the end of the form and then put your signature. This helps to ensure that no one could go back and add additional information to your narrative entry. And always, of course, enter your narrative entries and any other charting for that matter in pen. Never use a pencil. Should you make a mistake in a narrative entry, there are two things you do not want to do. Number one, do not use whiteout. Never in any part of a client's record would we use whiteout to change the information. And number two, do not scribble out your mistake where it would be completely obliterated. This would suggest or could suggest in a legal proceeding that the documentation had been altered or falsified. If you make a mistake, simply put one straight line through the mistake, write the word error, initial it, and then continue your entry in the remaining blank space. This is important from a legal perspective. Should this record ever be used in a trial or other legal proceeding, we want to show that it was simply an error and not that we were changing or somehow falsifying a client's record.
Sometimes when I'm charting, it's very tempting to put my opinions down about a client, such as I think he's faking it or exaggerating his symptoms, but that's not my job. It's important for me to just document what I've seen, what I've heard, and what I have observed.
The most important rule to follow is you want to state just the facts. Do not give opinion, do not list the suspected diagnosis or anything along those lines. Simply state the facts of the situation. So for example, if you came in a client's room in the morning and found them on the floor, and the client told you, "I just fell and my head really hurts," and you responded by calling 911 and ensuring that they were transported to the hospital, after that situation, you would of course want to make a note in the person's chart. However, you would not state in your narrative entry that the client fell. The reason is you did not actually see the client fall. Remember, we want to stick to just the facts. No opinions and no assumptions should ever be put into a narrative entry. So in your note, you would state something along the following lines. Entered client's room at 8:05 a.m., found client on floor. Client stated, and then use quotes, "I fell, my head hurts," end quote. 911 called at approximately 8:30 a.m., client transported to hospital via paramedics. That narrative entry states simply the facts. Here are some important documentation do-nots. Do not give your opinion in a narrative entry. Remember, just state the facts. Do not give unauthorized persons access to a client's record. Do not discuss a client's care in a common area or over a walkie-talkie where other persons might hear it. Do not leave charts or other pieces of documentation in public areas. Do not wait until the next day or next shift to complete your documentation. Always complete it at the time that the care is provided.
I know charting is very important, but sometimes I get to work and there is a million things to do the second I walk in the door. And a lot of days it's like that all day long. And it's easy to let your charting wait till the end of the day, but that makes it easy to forget things and not get all the documentation that you need. So I try my best to make time throughout the day, just a couple minutes at a time, to do my charting. That keeps it fresher in my mind, and then it's not such a big chore at the end of the day.
Do not use whiteout or scribble out entries in your documentation. And most important, do not be afraid to ask for help. If you're ever unsure of your documentation, ever unsure of what type of entry should be made, or unsure of who should have access to a client's record, speak with your supervisor. They are more than happy to help. Documenting your client's record can sometimes seem tedious and time-consuming, but rest assured that taking the time to complete thorough and accurate documentation helps to ensure that your clients receive the appropriate care and services that they need.
One of the nurses, Sally, she was so helpful. She was just wonderful. She sat down with me, helped me through all the paperwork. I mean, she was just wonderful, and everything turned out great, and she even took some of the paperwork to the doctor for me.
Additionally, by completing thorough records of client care, you help to protect both the facility in which you work and yourself from liability. Much success to you in maintaining your client records.